The topic for panel 4 is the Indo in INDOPACOM. Moderating the panel is Dr. Robert Tomlinson from the U.S. Naval War College. Providing their perspectives on the panel are a distinguished number of experts, including Dr. Anit Mukherjee from the I should know this, I've lectured there, Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, Dr. Sumit Ganguly from Indiana University, and Dr. Joe Felter from Stanford University. Dr. Tomlinson is Associate Professor in the National Security Affairs Department at the Naval War College at the Naval Postgraduate School. Received his BA from the College of Holy Cross in Massachusetts, and holds master's degrees from several California universities, including Claremont. His area of study is Shia representation in Lebanon. Dr. Tomlinson, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, General, and thank all of us here for joining this, I think, very, very important forum. We're really, really fortunate to have these three panelists on here. I see Dr. Mukherjee, and hopefully others will join us. There we go. I see Dr. Felter there, and hopefully we'll see Dr. Ganguly very, very shortly. In December 2008, the then Secretary of Defense codified the importance of India in our national security strategy by renaming our oldest combatant command, Pacific Command, to INDOPACOM. And so I think more than anything, it's great to have these three experts really focus on India. Now, this panel is absolutely fantastic. Not only do they have academic bona fides, but two of them, Dr. Felter and Mukherjee, also have military experience to back it up. And Dr. Felter also has been in the policymaking realm as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, or DASD, for South Asia. So please, I would enjoin all of you to read their bios. They're very, very extensive, but I don't want to take up too much more of the time. And I'll start with you, Dr. Mukherjee, in your discussions. Now, you'll have about 10 minutes, and after that, then I'll be kind of draconian for getting you off the stage so we can have some discussions afterwards. So thank you and welcome to the forum.
Thank you so much, Bob. It is really good to be here. It's an honor and a pleasure to be in front of such a distinguished gathering. I'll start by saying this. India is going through a really difficult time. As I'm sure you're all aware in the news, my parents are in Delhi. It's a catastrophe. It's the news out of the country is heartbreaking. At this particular time, we are really appreciative of the help that is being offered to us by the American people, the American government, and by INDOPACOM. It means a lot to us. And I didn't want to start the talk in such a somber note, but I think it's also important to keep the context of what we are talking about here. Also, I thought, I heard a little bit of the earlier panels, and it seemed to me that all of the speakers were saying, oh, pay attention to us, pay attention to Africa, pay attention to Taiwan, pay attention to Korea, pay attention to Australia. And I'm like, okay, pay attention to India, because India is the only country that has an ocean named after it. So the India has to be in the smack in the middle of it. You have to pay attention to India. If you could put on some slides, I have some very brief slides, and I'll use that as a segue for a discussion about it. Can we start with the presentation, please?
Just a second, see if I have technical people. There they are.
Yeah, there we go. So I'm going to talk about three things. What are the challenges of the Indian Armed Forces? Two, the current state of transformation. And three, the implications for the Indo-Pacific. I think this topic is important because I would argue that, especially in the Indian Armed Forces, right? I got commissioned as an officer in 1994. I served till 2003. I think we are seeing among the most significant generational shift in the Indian military, and I would want to apprise this audience about it. So the next slide, please. Before I start to get down into the weeds, I think let's start with the basics. If you see India, we have territorial disputes with two nuclear armed countries, Pakistan and China. You think you have a difficult time with Mexico and Canada, try staying along with these two countries. And with both of them, we have territorial disputes in the sense we have bloody borders with Pakistan, and we recently had a border skirmish with China. I've served in the borders, and especially when I was there from like 99 to 2001, it was particularly bloody. And so that is, and so in terms of the defense of India is the primary aim of the Indian Armed Forces. So externally, it has to deal with a two-front dilemma. That is, deal with Pakistan and China. So far, even up to 10 years ago, the primary focus of the Indian military was Pakistan. When I was trained, all our doctrines, all our war games were focused towards Pakistan. It's only in the last 10 years that Indian officers are increasingly articulate this problem of two-front problem. But now we have to even think about the rise of Chinese military power and what that means for the Indian Armed Forces. On top of that, the Indian military also is deployed for internal counterinsurgency duties and HADR operations. So if I was to use an analogy, imagine you're the American military, you're doing internal counterinsurgency duties within America and protecting two borders with Canada and Mexico. And on top of all that, you have to deal with external power projection. So when we look at the sort of threats that the Indian military undertakes, it fights entire spectrum from counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, conventional war fighting, power projection to nuclear warfare. It's the entire spectrum of operations at the same point of time. So you would have troops deployed for counterinsurgency who would then suddenly be expected to deploy at Siachen Glacier, then suddenly you are deployed at the Andaman Nicobar Command. It just is a challenging spectrum. Good. I have the next slide, please. Where does this take us? So this slide is sort of an overview of the Indian Armed Forces themselves. As you can see, we have a very large armed forces, Army, Air Force, and the Navy. And the job it undertakes is territorial defense, ground protection, as well as anti-insurgency operations. Now, if you see the size of the military, it's significantly large. Why have I put up the officers as a separate entity? Because as any armed forces know, it's the officers don't do the fighting, or they don't really add to the number. They actually subtract the numbers. All officers don't really count. And I can say that as a former officer. In terms of the operations, it has 19 different operational commands and significant amount of equipment. Now, if you see the strength of the Indian military as compared to the other Quad countries, whether it's Australia, Japan, India brings a certain quantity to the table. Now, if you look at the American equipment to the Indian military, it's been growing over the last 20 years. And that's among the significant changes that I want to talk about in the last slide. So if you see the American equipment to the Navy especially, it has grown, to the Air Force a little bit, Army is the least. Because there is a long lead item that we have built up with our cooperation with Russia. Which brings me to my first point, which is if the assumption on the American side is that the battle that they have to fight in the future is straightforward with China and Russia on the one side, then it puts India in a very difficult position. For India, it is probably not in the best interest of India for Russia to be on the outside. That ideally, it should be teaming up to check Chinese power. Because if you look back at the Cold War, America teamed up with number 3, China to defeat number 2, Soviet Union. Now America is letting the number 2 and perhaps 3 team up together. Is that smart strategy? That's something that I think ought to be debated about. if I could move to the next slide, please. What is happening now? So since the last 2 years, India has been going through a significant military change. They have appointed a chief of defense staff. More importantly, they're thinking about creating joint theater commands. So up until now, we had all different operational commands which were existing at different places. What they are doing or they're attempting to do now is create significantly, they are creating a theater command. It still hasn't started.
Yes.
There's still a debate
Excellent.
about the types of commands which would be established. But when and if it comes up, this will be a significant shift in the
Yeah,
Indian.
I see everyone.
Along with that, hey, Sumit,
Thank
I
you.
think you have to mute yourself.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi, Sumit.
Hi there.
I think you have to put on the mute button because I'm talking right now. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Okay, apart from that, what they are attempting to do is enmesh the military more closely into the military strategy. What I'm saying is what the element we are seeing inside India now is the most significant military transformation we have ever seen since independence. Organizational, intellectual, physical transformation. Why? Perhaps because of external threat, because now there is a feeling that, look, focusing too much on Pakistan can only take you that far. You need to start seriously thinking about this two-front line. And what has changed? I think the Ladakh incident and has ended the debate in the Indian military about the sort of jobs that they have to undertake for the future. The anger or the kind, like the fortitude is very clear. As crises do, they inject an element of clarity inside people. And that's what has occurred after the Ladakh incident. Could I have the next slide, please? So what did it significantly do? Firstly, it ended the debate in India about how do we deal with China. There's still elements of at least in the diplomatic circles who still argue that, look, you can still find some agreement with them. But at least within the military, it's clear as day. This is the most significant pressing challenge that we faced by the Indian military. Two, it focused again on elements like cyber and other threats. So three, the military is more willing to look for external powers. In fact, Indian officers are increasingly articulating about the need to team up with Japan, Australia, and of course, US. And fourth, it is a rebalancing of forces from the Pakistan border towards China. So there's these four significant changes that have happened because of the Ladakh crisis. It has pushed this idea about disruptive technologies and jointness. And I would argue that, that because of these four elements, especially the rebalancing of the forces, you would have an increasing attention in the Indian armed forces about how to deal with the challenge posed by China. Could I have the next slide, please? So the implications for the Indo-Pacific. Firstly, if you think about the use of like the land power, I would argue India is probably the only theater where you would have a direct encounter with the Chinese military. It's not perhaps in Korea, not in Taiwan, not in Japan, but if you really want to understand how the Chinese PLA is operating, guess who has the best experience of that under combat conditions? India. And I think because of the Ladakh incidents, the Quad has come back into the news. So the Indian military and the capabilities it brings to the table will have a significant impact on the balance of power inside Asia, no matter what. Two, and here I'll talk about Indian-American ties. Both the other speakers after this are far much more well established to actually speak about it. But if I could speak a few words about it. Firstly, people who deal with this relationship on the trench lines get really frustrated. They're all like, what do we do about India? It's so difficult to deal with Indians. They're not really allies. They're a different kind of power. I think senior people in the DoD get it that India would be an exceptional kind of power. And here's where I think I've stayed in America for a little while. I've been in India. I am from India. I think Indians and Americans are a little too alike in the sense they love to talk. They both talk at the same point of time. They need a relationship counselor, to be really honest. Americans think they're God's gift to the planet. Reagan's like just city on the hill. Well, Indians also think they're God's gift to the planet. Americans think about the city on the hill. Indians is like Sare Jahan Se Acha, which is in the whole world we are the most exceptional power. So when I see both the stakeholders in the room, I really want them to pipe down and say you have to listen to each other. So they're both exceptional powers. Talking to each other is imperative. And I think if you see the long arc of history, I went to the US in 2003. Among my first, the recollections was Christmas break 2003. I was a poor student. I was working in the admissions office along with my other American friends. And suddenly there was the soundtrack from the monsoon wedding. At that point of time, it was really big. And suddenly my American friends from Wisconsin, mind, these are cheeseheads, broke into Bhangra and they did it really well. And I was bewildered. That blew me off. I was like, wait, I've come from Punjab. I was deployed there. I leave Punjab and Bhangra and I come to America and I look at Americans from Wisconsin doing the Bhangra and they were doing it much better than I ever did. And they were like, oh, we had Indian friends. That's what we learned at high school. And they knew all the moves. And from that time onwards, when we look at the long arc of history again, where we were in 2003, 2005, to where we are in 2021, you ask any of the officials at that point of time and say, do you think we could be at a better place? Of course. But do you think you would have predicted where we are at today? I don't think anybody would have taken that bet. So, and the last point, there's a need for a military meeting of the minds. I think there are too many exercises that happen, but not enough at the senior officer level. That there's a real need. For instance, you have these exercises like the Yudh Abhyas type exercises, but you need a real intellectual discussion with people who are dealing with it, not just with the diplomats, with all due respect to the diplomatic community and the MEA officials, but we need it from people who are dealing at the operation level. I've just got a chat saying I have to end my talk now, so thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mukherjee. I really appreciate that. I want to introduce two other individuals. First, my good friend, Ambassador Harry Thomas, former ambassador in South Asia to Bangladesh. So thank you, Ambassador Thomas, for being here, and Dr. Ganguly, thank you very much for being here. Next, Dr. Felter.
All right, thanks very much. Well, thanks, Bob, for the chance to join. Ike and Russ, if you're listening, thanks for the chance to join this great group, and a real privilege to be here with Anit and Sumit. I look forward to hearing your comments. So yeah, Indo and the INDOPACOM. I was asked to provide a practitioner's perspective. So I'll give that a shot, based largely in the context of my not too long ago role as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia, as well as Oceania at OSD Policy. But when I arrived at OSD Policy in 2017, then Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis had pulled me in, not so much kicking and screaming from Stanford, but I wasn't expecting to be there. But soon after I got there, he pulled me in for a kind of an in-brief, and he said, Joe, your three most important countries in this region. And I'm thinking, oh my God, there's like 30 plus countries. I got a lot to learn. He said, India, and India. So I got the message, and you know, I certainly every relationship with every country is important, but I think there was a recognition at the time just how critical the U.S.-India relationship was on so many levels, certainly on our defense and security level. The NSS, the National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy, was published. Huge emphasis on, you know, we're recognizing that we're in great power competition, that we're going to compete effectively or not, you know, through our line of effort too, if you will, if you're familiar with the document, you know, strengthening alliances and building new partnerships. In India, just at the top of everyone's list as far as this is the real priority. If we can get U.S.-India right, everything else can fall into place much more easier. So I made about a dozen trips to the region, and we'll work a lot with my colleagues at the Indian Embassy and around Washington and throughout the region. For the rate of my few minutes here, I thought I'd just try to touch on a few points. One is to describe the positive momentum that we're seeing in U.S.-India relations, so starting out without its challenges. Then maybe highlight some of the broad challenges that we are facing and that we can anticipate facing going forward. And then maybe, if not too bold, just throw a few broad recommendations out there from a policy practitioner perspective to maybe inform the follow-up discussion. So starting with the momentum in the U.S.-India relations, we're natural partners. We got shared values, shared interests. We're culturally close. But I kind of agree with you, Anit, that sometimes we need a relationship counselor. Despite our aligned interest in values and closeness on so many levels, we just have our frictions and our challenges. But many would argue that defense cooperation in particular is driving the broader relationship, and I would have to agree with that. And that's something I'm a little more familiar with, so I'm going to focus on that. So maybe going back to 2015, when then Secretary Ash Carter designated India as a major defense partner of the United States, only one like it in the world, given it the status of our closest treaty allies. Bob, I think you mentioned this in your opening remarks, but I was at this event in 2018 in Honolulu, but we redesignated Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command. That was Secretary Mattis there at the change of command between Admiral Harris and when he switched out. And this was certainly an acknowledgement that the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean kind of bound this large piece of terrain. But it was really a nod to India, if not explicitly, certainly implicitly, in recognizing that its incredible importance in the region and the incredible importance that cooperating with India on all things security cooperation, economic cooperation, in this broad region is going to be critical for success. So again, a lot of good momentum. We passed a number of what we call enabling agreements. And these are like the foundation that are going to help us build greater interoperability, increase defense technology transfer, share information like geospatial information. And if you're familiar with the acronyms, the LAMOA, the COMCASA, Communications Compatibility and Security Agreement, which I was the lead negotiator on that, ISA, Industrial Security Annex, BECA, Basic Exchange Cooperation Agreement. These are critical. Now we've got the framework in place to cooperate, to share information, to share technology, and to really increase the interoperability that's so important if we're going to cooperate more. Also in 2018, we had the first 2+2, if you will. That's when our Secretaries of Defense and Secretary of State, and then Secretary Mattis, Secretary Pompeo at the time, met with their counterparts in Delhi. I joined that group. First ever for India, the first ever for the United States with India. Very, very important. We've held them annually since then. And we're increasing our mil-to-mil cooperation, increasing our exercises, bilateral, trilateral, multilateral. Our defense sales went from almost zero in 2008 to over $20 billion today, and the trajectory is still going strong. A lot of weapon systems we've sold India. The Sea Guardian, if you're familiar, that's the first time we've ever sold something like that to a non-treaty ally ever. And again, I think the momentum is not just with the U.S.-India relationship, but it's with India and building its closer relationships around the region. They've concluded agreements with our close allies and partners like Japan and Australia, and that's important. Quad cooperation. India was often the long pole in the tent, if you will, as far as getting the Quad to cooperate. But as we've seen, just certainly since the new administration took over and President Biden made a ministerial level Quad meeting, it was virtual, but hugely significant to bring India into the Quad with Australia, Japan, and the United States, that creates so many opportunities for closer cooperation. So that's the good news. But here's some of the challenges. And I'll try to state these really broadly. And Anit, we have members on the panel who know this much better than me. But here's some broad challenges. India is a proud, sovereign, independent country. That's not a challenge, but we really need to remember that. They are going to pursue an independent foreign policy. They do not want to be anyone's ally, certainly not the United States. They will cooperate when their interests are aligned. But we cannot push them to even appear to be an ally. When I was negotiating the COMCASA back in 2018, multiple trips to Delhi, I started to get it, because they would just have a problem with any verbiage, any wording at all that even hinted to the fact that they were losing any autonomy or any way tilting towards the United States as an ally. So we have to be very, very careful of that. And just recognize we're going to cooperate when our interests are aligned, but there are going to be a lot of occasions where our interests are not perfectly aligned. And we're just going to need to respect that. And here's another big challenge. And I call this, the perennial U.S. foreign policy tension of balancing principles and interests. And we have a lot of shared interests in cooperating, ensuring the region remains free and open, but we then have concerns about human rights, about democracy, and balancing these two concerns and these tensions is something every administration is going to face, and we're certainly seeing it now. But we have to appreciate that we're going to have principles and interests, and sometimes pursuing one is going to come with some compromise on the other, and we need to balance that very carefully. So let me wrap up with some recommendations. On the last point, we need to be careful how we strike that balance between principles and interests. Thanks to General Howard here, I think he's on the call. I had a chance to study international relations in theory in grad school, and we all know that states cooperate based on shared interests. And that U.S. India, they have a lot of shared interests, preventing China from breaking the rules, cooperating in combating terrorism, increasing regional growth and stability in general. A lot of shared interests, but also our values are important. But I tell you, the U.S. and this is certainly, I think we should be a champion for human rights and democracy and other values. But we are going to have less ability to promote our values in any country, most importantly India, if our relationship deteriorates. So we need to strike that balance with this in mind. And in the context of India, I would say that some concerns that we may have on the value side, they're better voiced privately and out of the media. The domestic media in India, it's brutal. So we need to be careful of that. And again, we have a whole government engagement approach with India. And again, I'm out of government now, I can speak a little more freely, but I will just say in general terms, on the defense side, I thought that some of our activities on building the defense relationship weren't always coordinated and synchronized well with some of the other instruments of national power, such as economic and trade. We got to make sure that if we're going to sanction India on one hand and try to build a defense relationship on the other, that they have to be synchronized. And so sometimes I would argue that they've been at odds and could be at odds going forward. And again, we need to invest in avoiding the skepticism within the Indian government and really within the Indian people. And I think our panelists can speak more to this than me, that whether the United States can be considered a reliable partner going forward. This is critical. We've had some hiccups in the past. When we sanctioned India after the '98 nuclear test, decade to get beyond that. Let's not do that again. I'd like to say we need to, as far as another recommendation, I say let's put the M in the MDP. Let's put the major in the major defense partnership. We have to acknowledge that India is a major partner at the same level of our allies. Well, let's treat them like one. Let's increase our defense technology transfers. We need to safeguard our technology, play by the rules, but let's not hold it hostage for legacy reasons. That should be less constraining in the context of the current relationship, and threat environment. I really think that, or like take our export controls, for example, there's space for subjective interpretation. And we need to make that interpretation based on 2021 threat conditions and status of the relationship, not Cold War concerns about I'm talking about Russia and India's closest to Russia back in the day. For example, we need to put our best technology on our fighters in the current fighter competition. If you're familiar with that, or F-21 or F-18, we're not going to be able to compete if we don't give them our very best technology. They're a major defense partner, and I argue we should provide them a path to even our more advanced platforms, to include the F-35. And you mentioned this, but you can't overstate the importance of the Pakistan challenge with India, and we need to be very cognizant of that. We've got a lot of U.S.-Afghan war veterans on the audience here today, and we understand and share India's concerns about Pakistan harboring terrorism. But I was in Delhi in 2019 after actually at South Block, their equivalent of the Pentagon, when the Indian fighter was shot down. Just saw what a flashpoint the India-Pakistan frictions can be, and we could go to war between two nuclear powers, and then that would be pretty bad. This is Special Forces Friendly Cloud here, being at JSOU and SOCOM. So I say another recommendation: we got to work by, with, and through India. It's not just the U.S. and India working together, but the more we see India assuming its natural position as a regional power, the better. So we need to empower India to be a net security provider. Increase greater multilateral cooperation, with or without the U.S. being involved. If India's making it happen, that's great. But cooperation is a two-way street. Let me kind of close here a bit on India needs to stand up to the plate and walk the walk too. India, it's not going to cut off its sales, defense sales with Russia, for example, but it can do a lot more to reduce new purchases. Buy French, buy Israeli, buy something other than Russia. And some of the recent purchases, I think, are giving us cause concern. And most notably, the purchase of the S-400, which may have been hard to walk back, but that that results in sanctions, the countering Americans, or the catch of sanctions, if you will. That's going to really undermine the relationship, and we need to avoid that. But India needs to play ball with this. So, and understand that with India needs to understand that buying U.S. equipment, it's not only investment in quality defense equipment, but it's an investment in the relationship. So it signals who you want to build your relationship with. And a lot of us are friends with General Hooper, who was the director of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. And he made this great case that, it's not just buying equipment, it's investing in a relationship. India needs to appreciate this. And when it makes its defense sales, it's signaling the horse it's going to hitch its wagon to, the partner it wants to partner with, and the relationship it wants to build. So, for example, there's an open fighter competition right now. It would be a huge lost opportunity if India doesn't choose at least one U.S. option in the two that it's looking for with its Navy and Air Forces. So let's hope they make a decision that's consistent with the importance of the U.S.-India relationship. So let me just conclude with, I'm at the Hoover Institution now here at Stanford, and our new director, Condoleezza Rice, she will say repeatedly that there's no more important relationship to the United States to the United States, India, and the region than the U.S.-India relationship. So I would say that the future of the region and beyond, it's really going to be defined by the nature of this relationship. And we want to see a strong, independent, capable India. We want to see India assuming its natural role in the region as a net security provider. Again, that's in India's interest, the U.S. interest, and it's in the interest of all countries that have a similar vision for a free and open region, for a rules-based order. So the stakes are high. Maybe we need a relationship counselor, Anit, but whatever it takes, we need to make sure we build this relationship and make the right policies that strengthens it and does not undermine it. So look forward to this new administration getting to work and picking up on the momentum that we've gotten started. So back to you, Bob. Sorry if I went.
Okay. Hey, thank you, Dr. Velto. Next, Dr. Ganguly. Thank you very much for joining us. You're muted, sir.
Thank you once again for this opportunity. I am delighted to be part of this panel, and I have a hard act to follow because both of these two presentations have not only been extremely compelling, but I find hardly anything to disagree with. Their views accord extremely well with my understanding of where the Indo-US relationship stands and where it's headed, and what are the principal impediments in that relationship. I am primarily going to focus my remarks on how I see New Delhi viewing the relationship with the United States, and particularly on the issue of the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. And to some degree, there will be an overlap with what the two speakers have already discussed, but that's virtually inevitable. That said, I'm going to make 5 points. First, I think it's extremely important that there is continuing Indian ambivalence about the Quad. And this was best best underscored in the remarks that Subramaniam Jaishankar, the foreign minister, made at the recent Raisina dialogue, the annual Raisina dialogue, where for no particular reason that was discernible, he said, the Quad will never be an Indian NATO. Well, will never be an Asian NATO. Whoever suggested that it would be an Asian NATO? This was completely gratuitous. The remark was made, in my view, largely because he was assuaging a domestic audience that still remains uncertain about the relationship with the United States and about the precise dimensions of that relationship. It was clearly with one eye firmly cocked on a domestic audience, because otherwise it was an entirely gratuitous remark. And this is not someone who is lacking in intelligence or sophistication by any means. So this was not just some throwaway line that was included in his brief. Second, and this is related to that point, India still has not made up its mind between what international relations scholars called self-help, which means relying on one's own capabilities, mobilizing one's own resources, and directing one's resources towards meeting external threats, or external balancing, most importantly, turning to the United States. And there's a supreme irony here, which the vast majority of scholars have completely overlooked. And that is, it's not as if India has been the poster child of strategic autonomy throughout its post-independence history. But people keep talking about strategic autonomy and non-alignment, its predecessor, as a constant. And yet, there is this historical amnesia of that period between 1971 and 1991, 20 years, when India was basically a Soviet stooge. Not to put too fine a point on it, when India maintained a deafening silence over the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Why? Because it was a period of strategic dependence. India relied on the Soviet Union for bargain basement prices for weaponry, an uninterrupted supply of sophisticated weaponry, but the price was silence on certain issues critical to the Soviet Union. And so this whole notion of strategic autonomy, as if this has been a hardy perennial in Indian foreign and security policy, is utterly mythical. There was no strategic autonomy that India enjoyed during those 20 years. Let me be abundantly clear about this. But the point remains that India still has not completely decided that external balancing is the way to go, despite what Amit said about the Galwan incident and subsequent events concentrating the mind of the Indian military. That's perhaps true. But within the larger foreign policy establishment, there is this continual unease. And the third point is that this residual attachment to this nebulous concept of strategic autonomy will have a sandbagging effect on the evolution of the Indo-US relationship. And if we ignore this here in the United States, we ignore it at our own peril. Let's not elide over this problem. It exists, and it will continue to exist until some people alight their funeral pyres, which may be sooner than later. Fourth, there is a significant problem of India's industrial base, defense industrial base. India has not solved this problem and is not about to anytime in the foreseeable future. When a country that is industrializing and keeps talking about self-reliance in the realm of military capabilities, especially something that the present government has talked about, it cannot still make a decent rifle. Anit has been in the Indian Army. He knows how well the self-loading rifle works. It cannot operate in certain or high altitudes, and it cannot operate in certain temperatures. And if you cannot even, if your ordnance factories, after nearly 75 years of independence, cannot manufacture a decent rifle, you have a significant problem with your defense industrial base. And yet, there is a tradition of incrementalism, gradualism, not to mention the world's most labyrinthine defense acquisition process, which there have been various attempts at reform, but it still remains the most convoluted, opaque process, and often involves individuals who may be now in the Ministry of Defense, but their last posting, and this is not a joke, this is not apocryphal, it really does exist, whose last posting might have been in the Ministry of Animal Husbandry. Such a ministry does exist. So this generalist model that India continues to rely on, where you pick out an individual, however talented and able, but she or he has no particular expertise on artillery, on tanks, on missiles, and the like, and expect that individual to suddenly come up to speed in terms of deciding whether to buy the F-18 or the Rafale. this is going to be a significant bottleneck in the years ahead, unless India undertakes the reforms that Anit has made himself hoarse talking about and spilling ink over. Fifth, and this is something that has been raised already, but this is something we should be aware of, and we have to find a deft way of dealing with this and slowly wean the Indians away from this dependence. And by this, I refer to India's continued dependence on Russia for acquisition of certain kinds of weaponry. The S-400 has already been discussed. And obviously, this has raised significant concerns in the US defense establishment. It runs afoul of CAATSA, and there are efforts underway, I understand, to somehow exclude India from the strictures of CAATSA. But this is something, it's as McGeorge Bundy said about Plyco during the Vietnam War, Plyco is like a streetcar. There's another one coming. Similarly, with this problem with the S-400, this is like a streetcar. There's another one coming, because there are certain forms of technology that India feels that it can only rapidly acquire from Russia at a reasonable cost without the Duma exercising too much oversight over the sale. And unfortunately, this is a structural problem for two reasons. One, because of path dependence. Close to 60% of India's weaponry is still of Soviet or Russian origin. And secondly, we have this entity in the United States called the Congress, which exercises oversight over the executive branch. And that's a constant. That's not going to change. And consequently, this is going to be it will continue to be a nettlesome issue. And perhaps the way out of this, as was just suggested, is to steadily induce India to move away from its reliance on Russian weaponry, purchase things from the Israelis, purchase things from the French, from the British, and above all, the United States. And here, we too have to demonstrate, as has again been said earlier, that we can be a reliable supplier, that we will not be fickle, that over a particular issue where we disagree, we don't walk home with our marbles in our pockets and say, sorry, you made a decision that we are most unhappy with, and consequently, the weapon sales that were in the pipeline are now blocked indefinitely. This happened during the Cold War for a variety of reasons, and particularly after the 1998 Indian nuclear tests, about which we know well. And it was a masterstroke on the part of the George W. Bush administration to consummate the US-India nuclear deal, which removed a significant stumbling block in Indo-US relations and generated an enormous amount of goodwill in India, a goodwill that India, in my judgment, has not adequately reciprocated on. These then I consider to be some of the critical issues confronting the Indo-US relationship, particularly as we hope for India to play a greater role, not only as a net security provider in the region, but to stand up to the growing challenge of the People's Republic of China and its increasingly aggressive posture in Asia, and especially in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ganguly. I have one question for all our panelists here that I'll start out with, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So, Anit, you started out with what is tragically going on right now in India as it relates to COVID-19. And I want to know from any of you, what's the long-term result of that concerning Indian national defense. Certainly, it will affect the politics of the region and the country, but how does that manifest itself for India's role in the Indian Ocean and confronting China?
Oh, I can try to take a quick stab. First
Sure,
of all,
Joe.
for anyone with family in India and friends, deepest condolences. What a tragedy they're going through, and we hope they turn this around. But trying to look at tragedy into opportunity. Well, certainly it's going to be a challenge for Modi, Prime Minister Modi. His self-reliance. He's things aren't. This isn't his best hour in the eyes of the public right now. So I'm a big supporter of Prime Minister Modi for so many other reasons, but I hope he can weather this storm. But turning tragedy into opportunity, and this is a great opportunity to cooperate. When they had the Quad virtual summit with President Biden soon after he was inaugurated, that was the first area of cooperation, was pandemic response, pandemic security, and this is a great opportunity for all India's allies and partners to assist and support in any way. But in the longer term, just another, it's cooperation, it's building trust, it's being viewed as a reliable partner. If it's pandemic response, that's one way to do it. So let's hope this is a great opportunity for one of India's major defense partners and other close allies and partners of the region to work together to help them get through this tragic time.
I'll take a quick stab at it because I've written about this in the recent past. In fact, if I may be so self-referential, I had a piece in the Outlook section of the Washington Post on Sunday on this subject. This was the chronicle of a disaster foretold. When you spend 2% of your GDP on your public health infrastructure, this was a locomotive waiting to hit you on the tracks. And it does not come as a surprise to me, though I do not mean to minimize the human suffering and the tragedy that is going on at the moment, because I have lost friends in the recent past, including this week. This is a colossal human tragedy, but it cannot be solely blamed on the Modi administration because this was again a result of path dependence. For decades, India has been investing in its public health infrastructure. What I fault Modi for are the election rallies, the holding of the Kumbh Mela in Haridwar, and a religious festival that takes place every 12 years in the midst of a pandemic. And also for the complacency of the government from January, when before the World Economic Forum, he announced that we've done better than any advanced industrial country, and did nothing to stockpile vaccines, personal protective equipment, oxygen, in the event of a contingency. A competent government would have engaged in stockpiling these things to deal with a possible contingency, and it completely dropped the ball on that. What's the long-term future? My argument, which I've made in a number of places, is that India does exceedingly well after major crises. After 1962, significant investment in rearmament. After 1991, the major fiscal crisis, dramatic change in the Indian economy and how it functioned. So it's in the wake of crises that India undertakes vital reforms, and one hopes this will be the case.
Thank you. Hey, I have Ambassador Thomas here, and this is a really a twofer for us. Ambassador Thomas has to be in a panel for the Philippines, where he was the ambassador to, but he also served as a U.S. ambassador to Bangladesh. So, Ambassador Thomas, if you could just give us a little perspective on South Asia, Bangladesh and India, and our relations there.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tomlinson. I was one of Frank Wisner's chumchas, accompanying him to see Sumit G over 20 years ago. So it is good to see you again, sir. Bob, I think the challenge is immense. And what we have to do is be patient, listen, understand India's cultural heritage, its history, why it aligned with Moscow when we were aligned with Islamabad, and don't think those things are easily forgotten. Their skepticism that we will cut them off from military purchases if they do what we deem is a human rights violation while we have having violations at home ourselves, not engage in name calling. But at the same time, it's not just on us. It is on India also. As Mr. Felter said, Dr. Rice called me out of Bangladesh to be her assistant out of 17 years ago. But as Mr. Felter said, it would help if India purchased American military goods. We have to build a close relationship. This is not going to be short term. The other challenge, of course, Bangladesh, a country that I deeply love, but corruption is thriving, ruining its economic boom, but it's strategically located with lots of natural gas because it's right next to Burma. And Bangladesh also has a schizophrenic relationship with India, given its history. So how do we manage that? Also, how do we manage Pakistan? Everybody is suspicious of us. So we have to actually be the big kid on the block, take some slings and arrows, take some chances, ignore some mistakes, and try to build a strong partnership, understanding there'll be times when we'll go forward and backwards.
Thank you, Ambassador Thomas. This one from our audience, and I'll start with you on this one. What are your thoughts about the U.S. rejoining Trans-Pacific Partnership? How will that affect our relationship with India?
Bob, who's that to? I'm sorry.
Anyway, I used Anit. How about you?
Thank you so much. Firstly, a couple of quick points. Firstly, I would ask Joe to name one of the ally countries of the Americans that have bought as much equipment that India has bought in the last 15, 20 years. It's not Britain, it's not really Japan, it's not really Germany, maybe Australia, Saudi Arabia definitely, but that's not really a democratic ally. The point is that, look, I think, again, it's important to look at the long arc of history here. When we look at how much India has bought, it's actually almost $20 to $25 billion. That's a significant amount of money that's paid in Indian cash. It's not in grant, it's not in aid, right? That's paid in, that's not what you have given. And I should be careful here because I know that this is, that's not how much you have given to the Pakistanis in the last 20 years. So I think, again, here's where I kind of go back and forth of why we really need to have the discussion about a relationship counseling. Because if you were to come back with that sort of talk, then the Indians would also come back and say, wait a second, who is offering us a SSN? Is it the Americans? Are they offering us something on lease? No, it's the Russians, right? Are you offering, and that's what Joe is also talking about here, which is, I'm sure he also fought a lot of bureaucratic battles. I know he is among the people who did a lot for Indian-American ties. I know that from other people that we have common friends. But you have to fight a battle, not just as was said by Dr. of Ganguly, not just in Congress, but within the lawyers. And we can all blame this on the lawyers because that's the best people to blame right now, within the State Department and the DoD. So again, I think when we talk about India has to do more, I would actually urge all of you to say, what specifically would you have wanted India to do in the last 4 or 5 years, especially since Modi came to power, that India has not already done? I could understand the frustrations about Comcasa, Lemoa in the past 10 years, but since Modi has come to power, every time I go to the US Embassy, they are, and Joe is acquainted about this, they are talking that the sky is the limit here. That what is holding both countries back is imagination. And here's where I think I would urge all of you to read, and I'm sure you're acquainted with this, Joshua White's paper on US-India kind of mill-to-mill ties, who has laid out a roadwork of what can be done. I think we can go back and forth about what are the sandbags kind of holding us back. When I look at who is articulating back in the Indian military about why we should buy American kind of technology, the Indian Navy. Why? Because they have got used to working with American technology. Let your goods do your talking for you. The Indian Air Force would increasingly articulate that C-17, C-130s are the most prominent face of the COVID response. That's doing great PR job for the US. So I think it's on the back end of, and I get it, senior DoD officials get the memo of how to handle India. But I think when you lead at the tactical and the operational levels, that is holding us back. When there is sandbagging on India's side, as was alluded to by Dr. Ganguly, there's sandbagging on American side. I'll end over here. I haven't spoken about the TTP because I'm not an expert on that and I don't want to get out of my field. Sorry about that, Bob.
Well, I'll throw that out to the whole panel. How does this trade agreement that really was a hedge against China and to develop greater cooperation between like-minded trading countries in the Asia-Pacific region, how is our now getting back into the TPP affect our relationship with India?
Well, maybe a quick stab at, and also just a reminder of the history. We probably would have withdrawn from TTP regardless of who won the whether it's President Clinton or President Trump. So this is not really a partisan decision. But I think there was an expectation that, okay, we're going to pull out of TTP and maybe negotiate something better, more in our interests. But that just didn't quite ever happen. And not just India, but all around the region. And, certainly my last job, that was a tough question. I would always say, I talk about defense and security, but everyone wants to talk about economics and trade. So I had to answer this question. But let's hope, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm in the current administration, maybe taking another bite at the apple of either re-entering a TTP or a TTP-like agreement, or perhaps negotiating those alternatives that have so long been waiting. But trade really drives the relationship. As much as I focus on defense, that's really at the end of the day, we are the security partner of choice. That's an easy sell, but we've got to earn our way back into being the economic partner of choice, or at least one of the choices out there. Because right now we're just not offering them near anyone in the region as much as we should and can.
Okay, I got a big one to end it up. We only have 5 minutes, and this could probably take us about a month to discuss. But what is India's grand strategic vision? And Sumit, I'll start with you. What is India's grand strategic vision?
India's grand strategic vision, I think, is in a state of flux. It sort of reminds me of this wonderful Hollywood film with Robert Redford called The Candidate, where he's a telegenic individual. And of course, Robert Redford was extraordinarily handsome. We all know that. And he plays this telegenic candidate, but who's otherwise vacuous. And he ultimately wins the presidential election. And then he turns to an aide at the end of the film and says, "What do we do now?" Well, for decades, India has been insisting, we want a seat at the high table. We have to be taken seriously. It suffered from the Rodney Dangerfield syndrome in a large measure. Finally, you actually accomplish this, because why? The COVID situation notwithstanding, decades of high economic growth, the acquisition of nuclear weapons, the economy that actually started to make a significant dent on rural and urban poverty. And so the world starts taking notice of you. The problem is Indian decision makers never thought about the day when you'd actually be called upon to say, okay, what do you want to do now? Just like Robert Redford confronted that problem in the film. And consequently, for the last decade or so, India has been scrambling to outline a role for itself. And the best it's been able to come up with is, we would like to see a multipolar world. Terrific, because they are still ill at ease about American dominance of the world. And consequently, the closest thing that India has towards a grand strategy is a role in the global order where it is one of the major poles and can make important decisions on questions of global human rights, on questions of global trade negotiations, on the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, on climate change and the like, that it will be a voice to be reckoned with. But beyond that, India really has not yet come up with a coherent grand strategy.
Great. Good. And
I'm going to disagree in degree with Dr. Ganguly. One, if you look at Indian contribution to UN peacekeeping, the maximum number of Indian soldiers have died for UN peacekeeping. When we talk about India's articulation in the past, it was at the forefront of the anti-colonial movement, like the decolonization movement. It was in the past. In the future, I would actually urge you, Bob, to think about which country has a grand strategy. And I would take issue with this grand strategy business, right? I mean, I would argue what is America's grand strategy other than maintaining preeminence, which is what it is trying to do, which is what it should want to do. I would also argue that actually India is not that uncomfortable. I would agree with Sumit that it was not comfortable at the end of the Cold War about American dominance, but it no longer objects to American, let's say, presence in the Diego Garcia, despite its diplomatic posture about the Chagos case. I think if you ask the Indians, they are comfortable with what America is primarily because, and it's not because we love the Americans, we go back to IR Theory 101, it's because of interests. Our interests are aligned about the fear of China and what China is doing. And whatever may be the debates inside India, the focus and the clarity that has come, at least within the military, there will still be a debate within the foreign policy community. That happens in all countries. The focus and the clarity that has come within the military will drive this relationship forward. I'm pretty convinced about that. If I had any money, I would still bet it on US-India relations.
well, great. Well, hey, listen, I'd like to talk about this longer, but I now have 20 seconds to wrap this up. First of all, I want to thank all of you. A great, great panel with great, great perspectives. And I think if we don't pay more attention to India and our relations in South Asia, we do it at our own peril. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you sometime soon.
Thanks for this opportunity once again.
What a great panel. Just a lot of knowledge and wisdom about the area. And also I want to thank Ambassador Thomas for making a cameo appearance. However, Ambassador Thomas, you are a panelist on the next panel, so don't go anywhere. You have a 15-minute break. Please be back in your seats in 15 minutes. Thank you.